April 18th, 1942. The North Pacific Ocean, 650 nautical miles from the Japanese coast. A bomber sits on the deck of an aircraft carrier. The deck is 142 meters long. A B-25 Mitchell needs 900 meters to take off. The math does not work. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. He was 45 years old. He had already been told by engineers, by pilots, by men who understood physics, that what he was about to attempt was not survivable. He climbed into the cockpit anyway. The ocean that morning was violent, 9-meter swells. The USS Hornet pitched forward and slammed down into black water. Spray crossed the entire flight deck. The bow dropped, rose, dropped again. Every man on that deck understood what they were watching. If the plane didn't lift in time, it would drop off the edge and disappear under 4,000 tons of moving warship. There were 79 other men waiting behind him. Here is what nobody talks about. Before a single bomb left the ground, the mission had already failed. The fleet had been spotted 250 miles too early. The planes would run out of fuel before reaching safety. The landing fields in China had no power, no signal lights, no contact. Doolittle knew all of this. He ordered the engines started anyway. How does a man fly a bomber off a ship that is physically too short into a mission that is mathematically impossible, and still say yes? That is the question this story answers. To understand what Doolittle was attempting, you need to understand what he was flying into. Japan, in April 1942, was not simply an enemy, it was a system. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese military had moved without serious resistance across the Pacific. The Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, Burma. Thousands of miles of ocean and territory absorbed in under 5 months. Tokyo believed it was untouchable. The Japanese home islands had never been bombed, not once, not in the entire history of modern warfare. Their military planners had built a defensive perimeter they called the Ribbon Defense, a chain of island outposts stretching thousands of miles into the Pacific, designed to detect any American threat long before it could reach Japanese soil. This was not just geography, it was a layered system. And inside that system, the Japanese people had been told something very specific. Their cities were safe. Their emperor was protected. American aircraft could not reach them. That belief, that psychological certainty, was the real target of Doolittle's mission. Not the factories, not the fuel depots, not the military installations. The certainty itself. Washington understood something that bomb tonnage could not solve. After Pearl Harbor, the American public was shattered. Recruitment was desperate. Morale in the Pacific Fleet was collapsing. America needed proof that Japan could be hit. Not strategically, not decisively, just hit. President Roosevelt demanded a strike on the Japanese mainland. His generals told him it was impossible. Land-based bombers couldn't reach Tokyo. Aircraft carriers couldn't get close enough without being destroyed. Then, a naval captain named Francis Lowe had a thought. What if a land-based bomber took off from a carrier? It had never been attempted in combat. The bombers were too large, the decks were too short, the physics seemed to prohibit it entirely. Every system has a seam. This one was 142 meters of wet, pitching steel, and Doolittle had already found it. But before a single plane could lift off that deck, Doolittle had to solve 3 problems that had no clean solution: the bomb sight, the tail guns, and the fuel. Every B-25 Mitchell carried a Norden bomb sight. It was one of the most classified pieces of technology in the American military: gyroscopic, precision-engineered, capable of calculating wind speed, altitude, and aircraft movement to place a bomb within meters of its target. It was also completely useless for this mission. Low-altitude bombing runs made the Norden's calculations irrelevant, and if a plane went down over Japan, the technology would fall directly into enemy hands. So a captain named Ross Greening sat down with scraps of aluminum and spent an afternoon. What he built cost exactly 20 cents. 2 pieces of shaped aluminum, a simple fixed angle, no gyroscope, no moving parts, no classified technology that could be captured. His crewmates called it the Mark Twain. It worked. That is the first contrast this story asks you to hold. The most sophisticated bombing system in the world, replaced by 20 cents of scrap metal and a man who trusted his own hands. The second problem was the tail guns. A B-25 carried rear-facing machine guns to defend against fighter attack from behind. But every pound mattered. The mission required extra fuel tanks bolted into the bomb bay. Something had to go. The tail guns came out. This left the rear of every aircraft completely exposed. If Japanese Zero fighters got behind them during the escape, the crews had no defense. No armor, no weapon, nothing between them and the pursuing aircraft except open air. So Doolittle's engineers picked up broomsticks. Wooden broomsticks, painted black, inserted into the empty gun ports at the tail of each aircraft. From a distance, at speed, in the chaos of a combat pursuit, a Japanese pilot would see what appeared to be the barrels of 2 heavy machine guns tracking his approach. He would hesitate. That hesitation might buy 30 seconds. 30 seconds might be enough. 80 men flew into the heart of the Japanese Empire with broomsticks in their tails and a 20-cent piece of aluminum where their bomb sight should have been. They were not reckless. They were precise. There is a difference. The third problem had no clever solution: fuel. A fully loaded B-25 had enough range to reach Tokyo from the planned launch point 400 nautical miles offshore, and then barely to reach the friendly airfields waiting in eastern China. Barely. If anything changed, weather, headwinds, launch position, the math collapsed. On the morning of April 18th, everything changed. 4:45 in the morning. The USS Hornet's radar picked up surface contacts. Then a lookout confirmed it visually. A Japanese patrol vessel. Small, maybe 70 tons. Riding low in the heavy swells, approximately 12 nautical miles ahead. Its name was the Nitomaru No. 23, a picket boat, part of Japan's outer early warning network. Positioned exactly where Japan's defensive ribbon was designed to be, far enough out that any threat could be radioed back to Tokyo with hours to spare. The original orders were unambiguous. If the fleet was spotted before reaching the 400-mile launch point, the mission was scrubbed. The B-25s would be pushed off the deck and into the ocean. 16 aircraft destroyed to protect 1 carrier. The fleet would turn and run. They were 650 nautical miles out, 250 miles too far. The Nitomaru had already begun transmitting. Somewhere in Tokyo, a radio operator was writing down a message. A fleet, American, large, heading west. The window was closing in real time. Admiral William Halsey made the call within minutes. The cruiser USS Nashville opened fire on the patrol boat. It took approximately 30 minutes to sink it. But the damage was already done. The transmission had gone out. Japanese Naval Command now knew American warships were in the Pacific, closer than they should have been. What they did not know, what no one in Tokyo could yet calculate, was whether those ships carried aircraft capable of reaching the mainland. That uncertainty was the last advantage Doolittle had, and it was shrinking by the minute. Doolittle and Captain Mark Mitcher stood together on the bridge of the Hornet. The system was tightening. Every hour they waited, Japanese air patrols would widen. Fighter squadrons around Tokyo would be placed on alert. The window between detection and preparation was closing at the speed of a radio signal. Doolittle made the decision. Launch now, 10 hours early. 250 miles too far from Tokyo, in seas that were actively dangerous for carrier flight operations, with fuel margins that, by any honest calculation, did not reach the Chinese coast. Filed, reinforced, authorized. Every pilot on that deck understood the arithmetic. They would bomb Tokyo. That part was survivable. The part after, the 1,200 miles of ocean and enemy territory between Tokyo and the airfields in Zhejiang province, that part existed only in hope. The flight deck crew began unchaining the first aircraft. Doolittle walked back to his plane. The breach had already begun. Now came the 142 meters. The Hornet pitched forward into a 9-meter swell. The bow dropped toward the black water. A Navy signal officer stood at the edge of the deck, a checkered flag in each hand, watching the ocean, not the aircraft. He was not timing the engines. He was timing the waves. The bow rose. The flag dropped. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 rolled forward into the gray Pacific morning. At the edge of the deck, for 1 second that no instrument could measure, the aircraft dropped below the sight line of every man watching. Then it rose. 15 more planes followed. Not one was lost on takeoff. The system had been breached from the inside of its own defensive perimeter, using a carrier deck too short, a bomb sight worth 20 cents, and broomsticks painted black. But the mission was not over. It had not yet begun. The official after-action report filed by the United States Army Air Forces described the Doolittle Raid in precise, measured language. 16 aircraft, 64 targets, approximately 1,900 pounds of ordnance per aircraft. Mission duration, approximately 13 hours. Damage assessment, moderate. That is what the documents say. What the documents do not say is what happened to the men after the bombs fell. Tokyo burned in 16 small places on the afternoon of April 18th, 1942. The fires were real. The explosions were real. Anti-aircraft guns opened up across the city, firing at aircraft that were already gone, already racing southeast at treetop level toward open ocean. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were doing the same calculation they had been doing since takeoff. Fuel remaining, distance to China, headwind speed. The numbers did not resolve. They never resolved. By the time the Chinese coastline appeared through the overcast, Every aircraft was running on the last margins of its tanks. The weather that was supposed to clear had not cleared. The radio beacons that were supposed to guide them to friendly airfields in Zhejiang province were silent. Washington had failed to notify the Chinese nationalist forces in time. The lights were off. The signals were dead. The runways were dark. 16 aircraft, 80 men, nowhere to land. What stayed with me, reading through the individual crew reports, was not the bombing run. It was what came after. One by one, in the darkness above the Chinese coast, pilots made the same decision. They ordered their crews to bail out. Men jumped into complete blackness over territory they could not see, could not map, could not identify as friendly or hostile. Doolittle himself pulled the ripcord somewhere above Zhejiang province and descended through cloud and rain and darkness until he hit the ground hard in a rice paddy. He stood up in the mud. He looked around at the wreckage of his aircraft scattered across the hillside nearby. And he sat down and wept. Not from pain, not from relief. He was certain the mission had failed. Certain the aircraft losses were indefensible. Certain that when he returned to Washington, he would face a court-martial. 15 aircraft lost. One landed in Soviet territory and was immediately impounded. Crew after crew scattered across rural China in the middle of the night, dependent on Chinese civilians to find them before Japanese patrols did. The man who had planned every detail of this operation sat in a field of mud and believed he had destroyed the careers and lives of 80 men for nothing. He was wrong about the court-martial. He could not yet know how wrong. But 8 of his men would not return at all. 3 crews came down in Japanese-controlled territory along the Chinese coast. 8 airmen were captured within days. What followed was not imprisonment. It was a systematic attempt to break American military personnel into providing intelligence that could be used against future operations. The 8 men were transported to Tokyo, interrogated, starved, subjected to months of isolation and physical abuse. Not one disclosed operational information. Not one. In August 1942, the Japanese military convened a tribunal. All 8 were convicted of what Imperial Japan called crimes against humanity, a charge that meant, in precise terms, that they had bombed civilian targets. The evidence presented was fabricated. The verdict was predetermined. 3 men were selected for execution: Lieutenant William Farrow, Sergeant Harold Spatz, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark. They were 23, 21, and 24 years old. On October 15, 1942, they were taken to a cemetery outside Shanghai. They were given a choice to kneel. None of them knelt. The records describe the execution in 4 lines. What the records cannot describe is what it costs a 23-year-old man to stand upright in front of a firing squad in a foreign country, knowing that no one is coming, knowing that the mission is already over, and still refuse to bend. The system had recaptured 3 of them, but it had not broken a single one. That is the line this story has been building toward. Japan built an empire on the certainty that it could not be touched. Doolittle's men flew 650 nautical miles past the point of no return to touch it anyway. And when 3 of them were put against a wall for doing so, they did not look away. When Jimmy Doolittle was pulled out of that Chinese rice paddy, he had been in the air for 13 hours, He had no aircraft. He had no communication with Washington. He had no way of knowing whether any of his other crews had survived. He had nothing except mud on his boots and the certain belief that he had failed. He was wrong about almost everything. In the days that followed, Chinese civilians and nationalist soldiers moved through the countryside of Zhejiang province in the dark, finding American airmen one by one. Farmers who had never seen an American, village elders who could not speak English, ordinary people who understood, without being told, that these men needed to disappear before Japanese patrols found them. Thousands of those Chinese civilians would later be executed by Imperial Japanese forces for helping. The historical record estimates that for every American airman sheltered and returned to safety, approximately 250 Chinese civilians died in the reprisals that followed. That number does not appear in most accounts of the Doolittle Raid. It should. Doolittle reached Chongqing, then India, then Washington. He walked into a debrief expecting a court-martial and found something he could not immediately process. The American public had learned of the raid. Roosevelt had announced it without details. He told reporters the aircraft had launched from Shangri-La, a fictional location, to protect the secrecy of carrier operations. But the effect was immediate and total. After 5 months of retreat, after Pearl Harbor, after Wake Island in the Philippines and the fall of Singapore, after every headline had carried the same message, that American forces were losing ground across the entire Pacific theater, one morning, Tokyo burned. 16 aircraft, 80 men, and the entire psychological architecture of Japanese invincibility collapsed in an afternoon. Japanese imperial headquarters had promised its people that the home islands could not be reached. On April 18, 1942, that promise was broken in 16 places simultaneously.
We've lost contact with the fleet.
They've broken through the
Japanese
perimeter.
military
Send reinforcements
response
now.
was
All
immediate
units to the
and
front line.
strategically catastrophic. 4 aircraft carriers and hundreds of fighter aircraft were recalled from forward Pacific positions to defend the home islands against a threat that was already gone. Those carriers would be desperately needed 2 months later, at Midway. Military historians have traced a direct line between Doolittle's raid in April and the Japanese strategic overextension that led to the decisive American victory at Midway in June. 16 aircraft did not win the Pacific War, but they forced the decision that did. Doolittle stood before President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the White House. Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor to his uniform. Doolittle tried to object. He said other men deserved it more. He said he had lost every aircraft. He said the mission's material damage was minimal. Roosevelt did not move the pin. Because Roosevelt understood something that military reports could not quantify. The raid was never about bomb damage. It was about proof. Proof that the Pacific Ocean was not Japan's private territory. Proof that American aircraft could find Tokyo. Proof that 80 men, given an impossible task, would climb into their cockpits anyway. Doolittle lived to be 96 years old. He outlasted the empire that tried to erase the men he led. He outlasted the generals who called his mission suicidal. He outlasted nearly every institutional certainty of 1942. In his final years, he was asked repeatedly what he remembered most about April 18, 1942. He did not talk about the launch. He did not talk about the bombing run. He did not talk about the Medal of Honor. He talked about the men who did not come back. Faro, spats, Hallmark, 23 years old, 21, 24, standing in a cemetery outside Shanghai with no one coming to help them, not kneeling. The raid did not destroy Tokyo. It destroyed something more durable than any city. It destroyed the certainty that Japan was untouchable. And it proved something about the 80 men who flew that morning that no court-martial, no tribunal, no execution could ever undo. They did not carry only bombs on those 16 aircraft. They carried the first honest answer America gave to Pearl Harbor. Not a diplomatic note, not a strategic withdrawal, not a promise of eventual retaliation. An answer delivered at treetop level over Tokyo on a Tuesday morning in April by men with 20-cent bomb sights and broomsticks in their tails. Japan built walls. Doolittle studied the seam. 80 men found it. 3 of them never came home. And not one.